Hello, everyone. Welcome into another episode of Bull Breakdowns here on the Guilty as Charged podcast YouTube channel. My name is Alex. As always, we're here for the post-win pods, and we're here for those vibes. But we're also here for some post-L vibes. The Chargers did lose 21-18 to the Giants today, follow the 3-1 end of the undefeated season. Disappointing loss. I understand a lot of the arguments that will be made for, hey, they lost the offensive line in this game. A lot of things didn't go great for them. They were starting backup linemen against the best defensive line in the league. Not a recipe for success. But even for every caveat you can give to the offense, defense, or the special teams, I felt that this was a pretty poor execution game, probably the worst one since the Cardinals game last year, to be honest, from a top one down offense, defense, and special teams. Just a lot of failures in those areas where the Giants didn't. The Giants kind of wanted to give them the game a lot of times, and the Chargers kept saying, "Nope, we're good." And the way that I would sum that up the best is Jackson Dart has 111 yards passing today. Cam Scatterbo has 79 yards rushing, but the Chargers had 107 penalty yards, both offense, defense, and the first special teams penalties of the season, right? So really, wherever you looked, it was kind of a mess execution-wise throughout. Let's start with the offense because I certainly think that's going to be kind of the story of the game this week, or the story that we talk about going forward, especially with Joe Alt's injury, who had a high ankle sprain. Looks like he'll be, we don't have an exact timeline, but based on the way he was kind of walking gingerly off of that. Luckily, X-ray is negative on the ankle, so that's positive. But we're probably talking about a 3-4 week absence, just based off of what I saw there. Possible IR stint, although I guess it's in theory possible he could be back before that. But at the very least, missing probably the next 2 games. And the Chargers, paid the price for that dearly today. And pretty embarrassing performance for the offensive line, like I said, even with the caveat that they were playing this Giants defensive line. For me, it wasn't, hey, you just got your ass handed to you by the Giants defensive line. It was the number of missed stunts. It was the number of things that the Giants did to really give the Chargers problems that weren't just, hey, we're going to beat you with a bunch of strength, a bunch of power. It was the variety of ways that they were winning on the defensive line. Whether, again, like I said, for the Chargers offensive line, a missed stunt, a missed block, a holding penalty, wherever that, responsibility should be distributed, it felt like there were a lot of ways that they were losing to this Giants defensive line. Some of that is just, again, the Giants have a really, really good defensive line, but some of that was absolutely preventable today. Pretty embarrassing performances, I would say, particularly by Jamari Salyer, who really struggled, and Zion Johnson, who kind of, earned a lot of goodwill, I would say, in the first 3 weeks of the season, but then obviously takes a step back with his performance today. Austin Deculus then comes in at left tackle. Not the best, not the worst, but Bradley Bozeman obviously took a step back today. Wherever you looked on the offensive line, not a good game. However, I think it's one thing if I just threw my hands up in the air and they just didn't get anything going on offense. So therefore, you lose these games. They win that game maybe if Joe Alt's in there, right? But at the same time, they did have success with things offensively. And I think this is where I'm going to talk about Roman next, because I felt like Roman kind of failed the Chargers in this game with the amount of times that he kind of took the ball out of Hampton's hands, right? Omarion Hampton, who obviously great game today, 12 carries, 128 yards, 10.7 yards per carry, 1 touchdown, and 54 yards on his breakout touchdown run. Also, 5 receptions for 37 yards, a long 19-yard catch, which was pretty important to set the Chargers up firmly in field goal range for their first scoring drive. He was great today, just like he was great last week. This was his best pure rushing performance. I would certainly say that in this one. And, even if you take out the long 74-yard run, 54-yard run, which was, well blocked, I would say, he was still averaging, what looks like 6.7. Yeah, I just calculated it, 6.7 yards on all of his other attempts. He was getting his today, which again makes it perplexing that, that drive after they had scored the touchdown in the second half, Greg Roman opts to go away from Omarion Hampton, taking the ball out of his hands and going 3 straight passes. Justin Herbert incomplete to Quentin Johnston. Justin Herbert 8-yard pass to Keenan Allen. Justin Herbert incomplete to Keenan Allen, punt. And that's obviously when J.K. Scott, I believe, let me just make sure I'm right there. I think J.K. Scott had a pretty questionable punt. He had a couple questionable punts today, all things considered. But that was a kind of rough sequence for the Chargers there. That was when Scott punted it 31 yards to the Chargers' 48-yard line. And so it's just like, okay, you just popped off a 54-yard run. Then you're going to go pass. Okay, now we're going to punt back, and then it ends up being a shank, which, again, we'll get to the special teams in a second, which were certainly special today. But I just didn't understand why you're not going to run the ball with Hampton, especially, in the first couple games of the season when it wasn't looking particularly good on the ground. I would say, especially against the Chiefs, but also in some parts of the game against the Raiders. If it's not looking good, I get dropping back and throwing all the time. But when it's looking good and you go away from it, then you're not going to get a ton of sympathy from me. And then also, I would say, where was the quick game today, right? The Chargers the last 2 weeks, especially with all the offensive line issues that they've had, the offensive line injuries that they've had, they've gotten, Justin Herbert's dropped back 85 times in the last 2 weeks. He's been pressured on 46 of them. 56% of his dropbacks he's getting pressured on. At some point, you have to go, hey, this is a one-possession game. We can't keep dropping back because it's not sustainable, right? It's some of these plays are going to get blown up. Some of these plays are going to result in bad sacks. Some of these plays are going to result in Herbert having to throw the ball away or taking an intentional grounding penalty, right? And so to not get the quick game going, especially when it worked in moments in this game, there was the field goal drive that I mentioned. He had the 19-yard reception, which put the Chargers back into chip shot field goal range on what was 2nd and 24, which was a pretty important moment for Hampton, and a screen that was well executed in that moment. So I when it came, can you call a screen every play? No. But when it comes to, executing the short passing game and just, getting easy chunk yards and completions, I don't know why the Chargers were so insistent on dropping back, especially when it wasn't, for most of this game, a 2-possession game. For most of this game, the Chargers were within 1 score, especially after the Omarion Hampton touchdown, after the Quentin Johnston touchdown in the first half. And so to me, the amount that they dropped back, the amount that they didn't lean on the run game, the amount that they opted to not go with a lot of, the quick game pass stuff, which was working at times with Hampton, that to me does fall on Greg Roman at the end of the day. And, Justin Herbert talked about it. Hey, we just got to do a better job chipping. We just got to do a better job executing. But if I can point to Greg Roman for one thing that they really couldn't, you have to take into account what you have. And dropping back 85 times in the last 2 weeks is just not going to get it done. Sometimes, like against Denver, Herbert is going to make a souffle out of shit. But then it's going to be this where, hey, the pass game's not working, but the run game is. And to not continue to rely on that was a tough look today. Now, again, this wasn't just on the offense, although, we can talk about some of the poor games today. I obviously thought this was a pretty good QJ game. Not a great Keenan game. A bad Ladd McConkey game. I would say his first true bad game of the season, even though people will point to his other statistical efforts. This was one where he did, I think, truly let the team down. I want to, they're dialing up Tucker Fisk and Scott Matlock targets on, critical drives in this game in the second half, which might as well be waving the white flag. Like, I don't know what that is. And just all the way down the stat sheet, the receivers obviously didn't do enough today. But also, they didn't have the offensive line to let a lot of plays develop, which, again, makes it so confusing to me why they opted to drop back this much and for this long as they did in a game that was largely one possession throughout. Didn't run the ball enough. We've already talked about that. The 2 turnovers were pretty uncharacteristic. Obviously, some blame will go on Herbert there. The second one was a Conklin pick that resulted in an OPI and Ladd tripping over Conklin. Again, clunky execution today. Offensively, there was another play I think Ladd was involved in where Gadsden tried to come out to run block, and then Ladd ran into him. So, again, just execution errors off of the line of scrimmage where they simply have to be better than that. And then, of course, Herbert getting a lot of balls batted in the first half at the line of scrimmage results in that Dexter Lawrence interception, which sets up a field goal for the Giants. Good tackle by Herbert. Good bend, don't break stuff from the defense. But, again, those turnovers are going to cost you, especially in a game that ended in a one-score game. So, very confusing day from the offense. Just looking, again, if I just showed you the box score and you didn't watch any of the game, you would say, hey, why didn't Hampton carry the ball more? You would say, hey, why are they chopping back to pass so much when all of their receivers except Quinton Johnston were off today? And I really have no answer for you, especially with the number of offensive line injuries they sustained. So we'll see what happens going forward. Obviously, the Joe Alt injury timeline will be crucial. We'll get more on that throughout the week, although with it being a high ankle sprain, I can't imagine that he's back before 3 or 4 weeks. So that was a tough performance from the offense today, especially against the Giants team that, while they do have one of the best defensive lines in football, this was not an unbeatable defense today. And I felt like the Chargers had a lot of self-inflicted and self-imposed errors, all things considered. So special teams is actually something I want to talk about today because I did think this was a pretty bad special teams game. Why was Tarheeb still returning punts? I do have to ask about that because, he's your CB1. And I understand Darius Davis is hurt. You don't have a ton of great options in this game. Counter Lambert-Smith didn't really do much today as a kick returner, all things considered. And, you don't want to put Ladd out there because if you put Ladd out there, then he can get hurt. But Tarheeb is your number one corner, and he takes one shot on a punt that goes the wrong way. Now you're suddenly playing without your top corner. So, I would rather put KLS there in the Darius Davis punt return spot. And, Tarheeb will get a lot of shit at the end of the game for trying to, on the last series, taking up a lot of 12 seconds of the clock by trying to run to the other side of the field. But to me, that's not on Tarheeb. To me, that's on the special team staff, which put him in that position to be the returner because, as we said, I just don't think he should have been the returner. So I don't have an easier solution, but I would rather have put, Kimani Vidal out there. I would rather put KLS out there, even if the returns weren't great, than potentially sacrificing your CP1 if he gets hit the wrong way on a punt. J.K. Scottshank punts today, nothing new, just underwhelming stuff throughout. I understand he's a hang time demon, but then he also has these games where, you're talking about giving the Giants tons of field position, which obviously cost the Chargers a lot in this game. So that was an issue on special teams. The kick returning game, like we just said, sometimes Vidal out there. It was Vidal and KLS. I don't really blame either of them for being put in this position. But, again, to me, more on the special team staff for you just kind of got to find the answers if Darius Davis isn't in this game. And I didn't really feel like they did a great job at finding those set answers. On all I really had to say from a special teams perspective there, but just a pretty underwhelming day for Ryan Ficken's unit, and it cost them field position, it cost them minutes on the clock, and the execution on that stuff needs to be better because, they came into this game thinking, hey, we're a little too good for the Giants, but, your margins on offense, your margins on special teams are going to cost you in big NFL games. And special teams, while it didn't have a direct effect, on the scoreboard, I think certainly cost them in a lot of moments today. Doesn't get easier because we don't know the status of Darius Davis going forward, or if he's going to be completely recovered from the knee injury, or frankly, if he's been that great this year anyway. But I would rather see him in there than anything I saw today, which is kind of disappointing because, they had a week to try to find something, and they found absolutely no answers on special teams today and risked Tarheeb Still as a punt returner, which I thought was a pretty bad decision, all things considered. Chargers defense, all things considered, was this an abysmal defensive performance? No. They held the Giants to 21 points. I think ultimately, if we went into this game saying that, if you went into this game just looking, again, purely at the stat sheet, and you said, hey, you hold Dart to 111 yards, you hold Scatterboo to 79, you're probably not freaking out about this game, and you probably would have said the Chargers won. But there were issues for me on defense as far as obviously tons of missed tackles. Everyone, really. I can't even point to a specific few players. We can talk about Alohi Gilman getting run over by Scatterboo. We can talk about, Derwin James having some missed tackles in there as well. I could list off the whole roster if I wanted. The tackling wasn't at the level it needed to be today. And Jackson Dart and Scatterboo on key plays, on key downs where they needed to make plays, really had their way running the ball in this game with the defense. And like I said, I think I would feel differently about this game if it was just, hey, Dart was on a heater and he threw for 250 yards. And it was, just not a good game overall defensively, and they just let up some plays. But, the Giants gave them, plenty of chances to get off the field. I go back to that field goal drive that Malik Neighbors got injured on. And the Chargers had 3 third downs, that they couldn't get off the field for. And they allow what was, I think at that point in the game, a 15-play, 47-yard drive for a field goal that takes 6 minutes off the clock. Now, they respond after that with a QJ thing, so it wasn't the worst thing in the world, but it was emblematic of a lot of the defensive struggles they had today as far as getting off the field on third down. The Giants were 7 for 15 on third down today and picking up a lot of those on the ground with Dart, with Scatterboo. That's just not really acceptable, especially when you have most of your defense, for the most part, healthy. So that was not great. I just felt like on some plays, like the ones where members of the defense just got ran over, like Scatterboo, as well as Dart, just kind of wanted it more. And sometimes in football, you just kind of get dominated in that way up front. And when you have, a pass interference penalty, 2 third downs that they pick up via running the ball on that field goal sequence, just sloppy. That was after Malik Neighbors had come out of the game, and the Giants get 3 straight third down conversions, right? That's just the execution issue. You have to get off the field in those scenarios, especially when points are at a premium for your offense. So, at the end of the day, they force, punts. If you look at the second half, ultimately, can you really blame the defense for this game on the scoreboard wise? No. Punt. The touchdown was just a 2-play, 3-yard drive as a result of the interception, which had just happened. Punt, downs, and then punt, right? So from a bend don't break standpoint, I think the defense did fine, but then they had 6 penalties of their own today. And I don't think this loss is necessarily, yes, it's mostly on the defense, for sure, compared to some games in Chargers history. But I think a variety of defenders really could have played a lot better today. Bright spot, Thule played pretty well. Obviously got 4 sacks in this game, 5 tackles for loss, 5 quarterback hits. So kind of keeping up on the season that he's had. So credit to him. Obviously, with a lot of the pressures that he was coming up with in the first 3 games without coming with a sack, he kind of caught a lot of flack for that on Chargers Twitter. So it was nice to see him have a good game. But outside of that, pretty rough day on defense as far as defending the run. Some moments in coverage that were pretty good. Gilman got the stop on the goal line near the end of the game. But at the end of the day, when you are giving the Giants as many yards as they did by penalty on defense, when you are, as bad as they were at defending the run from down to down, just as far as consistency is concerned. Scadaboo only had 3.2 yards per attempt, but he also broke off some chunk runs. Dart had 5 yards per attempt on 10 carries, and the Giants as a whole had 161 rushing yards, even though, no, it wasn't amazing efficiency at 3.8 yards per attempt. And, anytime you're going to allow the other team to run 42 times per game and really not make you beat them through the air, I do think that says something about the defense's performance today, which, again, not necessarily the reason they lost the game compared to some of the issues on offense and the Joe Alt injury and all those things. But, this was one of the worst offenses in the league coming in, and they failed to really reject a lot of the confidence that Dart and Scadaboo were feeling pretty early in this game. So at the end of the day, to me, that does fall on the defense. After the game, Herbert had a quote, which I think summarizes this game pretty well. Boy. He had said, it's part of the game, playing quarterback, you're going to get hit. Says the team has a good training staff and they will, have him recover well throughout the week. Got to be ready to get hit, is what Herbert said about taking 26 hits in the last 2 games. Jim Harbaugh was quoted after the game as saying, the hits he took were very concerning. You got to be able to put him in a better position. This Chargers team, and this is not just about Alt, this is not just about Slater, went status quo on the offensive line throughout the offseason outside of the addition of adding Mekhi Becton, right? They ran back, for the most part, all of their depth linemen outside of, spending a pick on Branson Taylor, who isn't even on the main roster right now. And, I hear the calls of the fan base, certainly, to try to trade for an offensive lineman, try to make some move that's not there. But their approach to the offensive line in the offseason is the real problem here. Because why is another team that needs offensive line depth, going to give you one of their precious backups that is certainly better than the Chargers backups for free, right? Teams traditionally just don't trade offensive linemen throughout the season unless there is some other issue to be had. So I sympathize with the Alton Slater injuries. Nothing that, you can necessarily do to supplant those injuries midseason, but I do feel like you go back to the last couple of drafts, the Chargers didn't invest in interior offensive linemen with any serious capital, and I do think it has come back to bite them, particularly in the 2024 draft, which was a rather deep interior offensive line class. So, we can talk about, how unlucky the Alton Slater injuries are. But to me, I do think a big failure of this offseason is not doing more along the offensive line, all things considered. So, I don't know how you fix that in season outside of just getting Alt back and trying to kind of fix the roster here, and trying to patchwork the offensive line as best as you can throughout the next few weeks. And kind of like I was mentioning, do a lot of the quick game stuff, a lot of the stuff that you could do to sort of fix the offensive line or at least stabilize it a little bit and make sure that, against the Commanders next week or, in their games coming up without Joe Alt, that their offense is a little bit more functional. And I think they could have done things today in that regard. But at the end of the day, when it comes down to offensive line injuries and some of the stuff that they did in the offseason, it's coming back to bite them now. And I didn't feel like calling them out every week, I guess, in the offseason, but we always talked about the draft and just how the offensive line looked in the preseason in some snaps and in these training camp practices. There were red flags there, and we still have a lot of the red flags that are showing up on tape now. And God knows if they didn't trade for Austin Deculus, God knows if they didn't make some of these, other moves they sort of scrambled to make. But at the end of the day, for a Harbaugh-ran team to have as critical offensive line issues they did without investing a ton of assets, even with the Alton Slater injuries, I don't have a ton of sympathy for the position they've in, because we've said that they haven't truly invested enough in the offensive line, and we've said that continuously. So, that to me is the main story of this game. And then Chargers head coach Jim Harbaugh after the game saying on a Marion Hampton having 12 rush attempts. In hindsight, lose a game, you always think what you could have done different. It's just a frustrating quote because, again, you go away from the only thing that was working in the offense today, especially when you're unable to protect Herbert because of some of the deficiencies that they had on the offensive line. So, got a lot of rant energy out today. Maybe this was a non-productive podcast. I don't know. But that was the most frustrating Chargers loss, I feel like, in a while. You were up 2 games on the division with tiebreakers over every other team. Obviously, the Chiefs get a win today. The Broncos have a pretty winnable game against the Bengals tomorrow. This was your chance to go to 4-0 against a very winnable Giants team that wanted to give you the game on multiple times. And again, 1 loss to an NFC team. It's not the worst thing in the world results-wise. But this is why, the media, as much as Chargers fans want to talk about them, and, football at large, will not take the Chargers seriously until they both beat some of the contenders and the AFC West teams that they did, and as well as take care of business against the teams you're supposed to take care of business against. And so, as much as, I want Herbert to get the MVP love that he wants to get, and he certainly deserves it for, in some ways, putting up with what he put up with today. It just needs to be a better product on the field when you have these winnable games. And I hesitate to look into the Dolphins game or the Titans game or some of these games that should be winnable and should give you some wins to secure playoff positioning when you couldn't take care of business today. And again, I'm not saying it was the easiest position to be in, but if you're Jim Harbaugh and you're this coaching staff and you want to be looked at as a contender, you just have to take care of these games. And it was pretty disappointing that they did not take care of this one. So that's all that I had to say on this one. Angry rants, penalties, all galore. I do not think this is the end of the world for the Chargers, but if they do not take some very serious lessons from this game soon, this 1 loss can turn certainly to a skid. So all that being said, we're on to Washington. Bolt up. See you guys next week. And hope you're coping with it better than I did. So see you guys next time. Alex, bolt up.